A reading from the Gospel according to Luke. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated.
How do we make sense of Easter? Good Friday makes sense. Even if the cross was unjust, we're familiar with death. But resurrection? It may seem a strange question for a preacher to ask. My wife Kim and I were watching the news in the wake of the terrible tragedy of the fire at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris this week. The news was reporting that they were able to recover some of their relics, including the supposed crown of thorns that Jesus wore at his crucifixion. Kim was really happy about this, and then she looks over at me, and I'm kind of smirking. She says, "Oh, come on. You don't believe it was the real crown of thorns?" I'm like, "No. Sorry." She tells me she wants to believe it and that I'm just too cynical. And I tell her that she's just too naive. And she tells me that she sometimes wants to be naive. Does that sound like anybody else's marriage? Then she looks at me and says, "All right, well, I'm just glad you're not trying to tell me that the resurrection wasn't real." Yeah, I'm not. I believe it. I believe Jesus was raised from the dead. But listen to what I just said. I believe it. I think you might believe it too, because, when we said Christ is risen, most of you, I think, said he is risen indeed. This is us saying what we believe. But believing doesn't always come easily, does it? Nor should it. After 2,000 years of declaring Christ is risen, he is risen indeed, Christians might forget what a big ask this is to believe this, right? We take it for granted, and to be honest, that's lazy. We read this account from Luke, and we want to be critical of the women. Why were they bringing spices for a dead body? Shouldn't they have known? And what about Peter and the others who didn't believe the reports about this? I mean, shouldn't they have known all along this was going to happen? Jesus had been telling them. Luke doesn't dress up the faith of the early church to make it look good. And that's good for us too, because it leaves room for us to join the women and the apostles in the always necessary process of coming to believe and of making sense of Easter. So, let's do that together today, okay? Let's use our senses to to try to make sense of the resurrection. Throughout the season of Lent, we have been using the theme, the grace of seeing. The poem by J. Philip Newell has been our watchword. I watch for your light, O God, in the eyes of every creature, and in the ever-living flame of my own soul. If the grace of seeing were mine this day, I would glimpse you in all that lives. Grant me the grace of seeing this day. Grant me the grace of seeing. Seeing is a sense, and it's the first sense we're invited to use in making sense of the resurrection. The women go to the tomb at early dawn. Some other accounts say while it was still dark. And anyone who's up and out early enough in the morning understands this perfectly, like some of us who were at the sunrise service at White Rock Lake this morning. It's that time of day when seeing is hard, but hopeful, right? You have the sense that if you're patient enough, things will start to come clearer. Light will come. I watch for your light, O God. If the grace of seeing were mine today. But not yet. Wait. It doesn't come all at once. If you don't see yet, don't fret. Keep watching. What the women see, though, at first, is not what they expect to see. They expect a closed tomb with a body in it. And what they see instead is an open tomb with no body. Luke tells us that they were perplexed at this. You think? We should be too. If the first thing about Easter faith is to watch for the light and wait, the next thing is to realize that not seeing what you expect to see is a good thing. The resurrection of Jesus should perplex us. It should make us question all those things that we think we already know for certain. I mean, if you can't trust a grave to be a final resting place, what can you trust? You know? If a tomb of death is going to become a womb of new life, my goodness, doesn't that just throw everything off? Right? What else might we not be right about that we are so sure about? Right? When Luke says the women were perplexed about this, he uses a word that means to be in doubt, not to know which way to turn, to be at a loss with oneself, not to know how to decide or what to do. Death is like that for us, isn't it? And the grief that goes with it. I mean, it's perplexing, disorienting, uncertain. I see this when I talk to people about funerals and memorial services, how hard it is sometimes for them to make decisions, to know what to do next. It's natural and necessary in a way as they have to begin to adjust to life without their loved one. But Easter ups the ante on all of this. It challenges you not to have to come to grips with the finality of a grave, but with the idea that a grave is temporary and not permanent. How do you adjust to that? The empty tomb invites us to employ our minds by emptying them with the empty tomb. Emptying them of all those ideas about the way we think the world is and has to be that we have sealed shut in ourselves. Maybe the empty tomb tells us there are more possibilities in life than we could have imagined. Next comes enlightenment. Not too much. Excess of light blinds as surely as darkness does. But here come these two men who are in dazzling clothes. Dazzling, love that word, right? It does not refer to bespoke attire. It's about more light that's coming. It's about these men in white. Things are beginning to brighten all the more. But it's almost too much for the women. They are terrified and they bow their faces to the ground. And isn't that the way it is with us when we are overtaken by a new insight? It excites us and terrifies us all at the same time. Like when someone first looks at you with loving eyes, you fix eyes on one another and try to believe it. Even if you do believe it, you may not be able to stand it. You may have to look away. You may even walk away. It may feel overwhelming. Maybe past hurts make you want to protect yourself. But you are invited to think otherwise, not to be afraid or controlled by what was, but to have faith and risk a new life and love. Why do you look for the living among the dead? The heavenly men asked the women. And look how that question changes everything. The women were looking for the dead among the dead, and who can blame them, right? There they are at a tomb. But you know, Luke uses the word for tomb, which is interesting. It's the word mena, or nema, from which we get the English word memory. A tomb is a place of memory, a place when we go there to bring up, to revive the memories of the dead person when that person was alive. And now these dazzling men in white shift the focus from memory to hope, from thinking about the life that was before to the life that is to come. They transform a tomb from a depot of despair into a home of hope. It will be an invitation to life now rather than a declaration of death. Remember what he told you, they say? Jesus had been telling them all along that he would come to this. He would be crucified and then he'd be raised. None of them took him seriously. Oh, now we do. We read that. We're here sitting in our cushy pews saying to ourselves, well, come on. Spring follows winter, you know. And life follows death. Of course Jesus was raised from the dead. They should have known. Yeah, right. But now another sense is revived in the women, the sense of hearing. They see the empty tomb, and now they hear these words, and they remember Jesus' words, and then they start to see. Not perfectly, but enough to go tell the disciples what they have seen. Now watch this. The women in this story were nameless until they start to testify to what they have seen. Then, when they find their voice and speak their faith, Luke tells us their names. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James. Brilliant. Luke is telling us that the resurrection is breaking the social stranglehold of patriarchy. Right there in the Bible. Listen to the women, he's telling us. What a novel thought. Women were the first Easter preachers, don't you know? And yet, 2,000 years later, you can barely find one in a pulpit proclaiming the resurrection. Go figure. God anointed them and proclaimed and anointed them and ordained them to proclaim the resurrection. And here the church is still silencing their voices. Shame on us. Well, Peter and the others didn't believe them then, and we don't believe them now when they tell us of their experience. The men dismissed the women as being silly. Did you hear? They thought it an idle tale they were telling. But, apparently Peter had second thoughts. And after dismissing their witness, Peter gets up. The word for gets up here is anastasis in the Greek. It's the same word for resurrection. In other words, Peter gets up and goes to see if Jesus has really gotten up after all. If you want to make sense of Jesus raising, you have to let yourself get raised too. Maybe roused. Get up. Make a move. Go. See for yourself. Look into this. Get in a position to see. Peter goes and sees what the women saw, which was nothing. Nobody. Nobody. Right? But he looked at least, and in looking, he came away amazed. And this is where our senses lead us. Like the open tomb, we are opened. We watch and wait. We're given enough light to see first that we don't see, and then we start to remember and wonder, and we start to see, and we wonder ourselves all the way home with now an imagination of what might be possible ahead. But that's it for Easter, really. Easter Day. Real belief comes later. What follows in the days after the story we read is that the risen Jesus starts showing up and showing himself to the church. First, two men are on the way to the village of Emmaus, and they're reading the scriptures in a chariot, and Jesus shows up and helps them make sense of what they're reading. And then they break bread together, and another sense is employed, taste. They can taste the Lord's presence among themselves. And then their eyes are opened and they see him as he is, for who he is. And then later Jesus appears to the rest of the disciples, and they think he's a ghost. And he says, "Touch me in my wounds." And they see him then as real. Another sense of touch. See what's happening? What's happening is Jesus is appearing as the risen one in everyday life, which is to say, no offense to anybody here, you're not going to be able to get the sense of Easter if you only come to church on Easter. The resurrection makes sense as you live a full sensory life, day by day among the people of God, where you start to see people coming to life, where you see people who are welcomed who weren't before, where you see people who are healed who weren't before, where you see joy capture them in a way never before. Kim and I enjoyed a Passover Seder Friday night at the home of our dear friends, Rabbis David Stern and Nancy Kasten. And, as you do at a Passover Seder, we rehearsed the story of when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. The future seemed impossible. They were daily dehumanized by their overlords, and yet God did a mighty thing and delivered them to the other side of the sea. The Seder isn't just about memory, though. It's about hope. Every time they eat the Seder, the Jews are asked to imagine themselves there when we were in Egypt. See? To make it present tense. The more Jews today, then, act as free people to free people from every injustice and oppression, the more they sense the liberation story of the Exodus is theirs. Hey, Jesus' resurrection from a garden tomb in Roman-occupied Palestine was an exodus. An exodus from the ultimate oppressor, the grave. The resurrection says that neither death nor those who wield the powers of death will have the last word. God does. Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa was asked about what animated those who struggled for so long against the crippling racism of apartheid in their country until at long last it was dismantled for good. And when it was, they didn't just turn around to exclude others who were included before. They included everybody. Right? Here's what he said. For us as Christians, the outcome is not in question. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ puts the issue beyond doubt. Ultimately, goodness, laughter, peace, compassion, gentleness, forgiveness, and reconciliation will prevail over their ghastly counterparts. The victory over apartheid is proof positive of this truth. There it is. Proof positive of the resurrection is when resurrection life replaces the ways of death among us. When we live like resurrection people, full of goodness and laughter and peace and compassion and gentleness and forgiveness and reconciliation, everything begins to make sense. Make sense now? Do you see?